Hello, I'm Leigh Wishner, FIDM Museum Registrar, and welcome to our conversation with Jeriana San Juan, costume designer for the popular new Netflix series Halston. We are thrilled to have you all join us. At the end of the evening, we will select a few questions from the audience, so be sure to drop your questions for Jeriana into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and not the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest. Jeriana San Juan is a costume designer with a career spanning television, film, Broadway musicals, concert tours, and dance. Learning dressmaking at an early age from her family, she cites her grandmother and her Cuban roots as a key inspiration for her life and career. For Baz Luhrmann's series, The Get Down, Ms. San Juan created vibrant costumes illustrating a 1970s New York from early hip-hop style to the glamour of disco. Other career highlights include HBO's The Plot Against America, USA's dramas The Sinner and Damnation, and the FX series Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll. Her early career included Saturday Night Live during the tenure of cast members Tina Fey, Bill Hader, Andy Samberg, and Kristen Wiig. Ms. San Juan was also the assistant costume designer for the Tony Award-winning production Legally Blonde, the musical. Ms. San Juan's work and commentary have been published in the New York Times, Vogue, Marie Claire, Vanity Fair, among others. You can now see her work in the Halston miniseries for Netflix, executive produced by Ryan Murphy and starring Ewan McGregor. Ms. San Juan's impressive costume design in the show is central to the story, spanning 4 decades of this famous fashion designer's life and career. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jeriana San Juan. Hello, Jeriana.
Hi.
So nice to have you here this evening. Thanks for joining us. Staying up late a little bit, I suppose, in New York. Are you coming from New York?
Yes, I'm in Brooklyn, New York right now, and definitely past my bedtime.
You're representing. Well, fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us. And, before we delve into the topic at hand, can you let us get to know you a little bit? Tell us how you got into the world of costume design.
So my way into costume design is via fashion. I thought I was going to be a fashion designer when I grew up, is kind of what I say, because I genuinely didn't know costume design could be a real full-time career. And I always was attracted and drawn to clothing and to textiles and to design, and also sort of through my life, also to theater and to dance and to stories and story making and storytelling and all of the above. So to me, it sort of started as fashion, then sort of veered over into costume. And I always say what made me decide to be a costume designer was a very boring meeting about heels. It was just it can be a very corporate environment, unless you're working with, the couturiers. And I think I work better on my feet. I work better when I'm more tactily involved with the clothes that I'm making. So it just sort of made sense for me. And and so Here I am.
Well, fantastic. And I've noticed that, in reviewing your career to date, there seem to be a lot of period productions that you've been involved with. And I was just wondering if you could illuminate for the audience the differences between working in contemporary productions versus period productions.
Yeah, well, I think I had a lot of more opportunities early on in my career with contemporary pieces because I was sort of coming to the table as the fashion girl. I had a fashion background, more of a fashion resume. So that was sort of my entry point. I had always aspired to do period work and fantasy. I think that's something that I just personally am very drawn to. But I think the difference is, between those two worlds in terms of contemporary design and period, to me, there's a lot more freedom in period. And that's something that makes me drawn to it. There's a little bit more freedom in being able to look back at something, because you can look back at something with remorse. You can look back at something with a freshness, as if you're living back in it. You can look back at it through rose-colored glasses, where everything's just a little sweeter and softer and prettier and lovelier. So, there's a lot of, to me, there's creatively, there's a whole nother layer kind of wrapped around it. I feel like that still exists in contemporary filmmaking and contemporary television. I just feel like that's a harder place to find. And, there certainly are directors that I really respect and admire that do contemporary in a way that I feel like I can jive with, but it's just harder. I feel like the eyes are more critical of the audience too. There's people it's harder to be subjective,
Absolutely.
Also there's a lot of, less criticism, I think, from your peers. And, the director is like, I don't know what existed in this time. I trust you. And I'm like, good. They're not doing that research. So let me just take some more liberties.
That's fantastic. So you get to be the one that holds the lens through which we view the past. And that's kind of a huge role in terms of a production. I mean, there's obviously so many things involved, but the costume design is sort of our first, we lay eyes on the costumes and they tell us so much right from the start. So I understand the nuances, and you seem to be somebody who loves to do research. So when you did the Get Down for Baz Luhrmann, how did that work sort of dovetail into your work for Halston? Did it help or did it hinder? What was that?
No, it totally helped. I mean, that job for me could not do anything but help. I mean, it was at a place in my career too, where I was really looking for some sort of break, and I, luckily enough, got along very well with Catherine Martin, who was hiring for the show and really the producer involved in terms of the creative, that was enlisted with gathering that team together, because she traditionally is the costume designer for all of Baz Luhrmann's projects. And they are a team. So my meeting with Catherine went so well. I mean, I don't even really remember what we talked about, but we had a great meeting. And I think I was just sort of expressing how I was so personally romanced by this story and how meaningful it was for me from my background, and the relevancy it had for me personally. I think she understood that I was going to make this, it was truly going to be a child to me. I was going to put so much love into this because it means that much to me. It still does. It's such an incredible story and beautifully written, and the cast was amazing. I mean, it was a really great project. And also, I think it's really tough when your first big break is also with Baz Luhrmann, because he's such an amazing director. And I think I maybe didn't even realize how lucky I was at the time working with him. I mean, obviously I'd greatly respected him and knew his body of work, and was hugely influenced, I think, in my own eyes because of the things I have been watching of his. But truly, that experience of working with him was about character development on like a whole nother level. It felt more actually like my theater experience, where we really discussed characters as a whole and communally between the props department and the set decorators and the actors, like in meetings about who is Cadillac, what's he into, what's his vibe, what kind of car does he drive, and I bet you that car would be this color, and what would look great are these color seats with this color jacket sitting in front of it. It was that kind of conversation, and it was just I really feel like it set me up for success, because I really was able to kind of get in there and be a huge part of that storytelling through the visual voice of the costumes. And it really just, I think, allowed these little buds in me that was very period, excited and fantasy excited, and it allowed them to open within me. And I think that's since been sort of the things that I gravitate more to.
Yeah, well, I can see that the real holistic approach of the whole universe for each character, how you really thrive in that environment. It's very evident, especially in your current project. So can you tell us how you got to be part of Halston, and did anybody have specific opinions or requests or advice for you when you came on board?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an important thing to note, if anybody is watching this who is an aspiring costume designer or currently a costume designer can relate, any sort of creative truly, that there was a long time between the Get Down and Halston. There was a long time between that. And I have, continued to, hustle, as they say. You got to keep working and you got to keep doing your thing, and not everybody's going to care about everything you do. So that's like a valid life lesson to learn right there.
Thank you for sharing that with our audience, because we do have people who are in costume design already and who are aspiring. So this is the straight talk. Thank you.
It's the straight talk. I feel like that's who I am. So you're just going to get the real me, guys.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's good. That's all we ask for.
No, truly, I think it's an important thing, and it's something that I really try to convey to my assistants and people who work with me, that it's really let's just learn from each other all the time. That's all I want to do is learn. That's all I want to do is understand what's the new thing that I don't know about, what is that technique that I don't know about, what is it that you like. I love learning from the younger people who work for me now, just about what their eyes are attracted to and what the references are, just so I can understand, as I'm creating something for an audience, what that audience frame of reference is currently. I think that's important. But anyway, I sort of lost track there.
Oh, no. So I was just asking sort of you're incredibly generous. Obviously, I can tell what a generous person you are with your whole crew. But what I really wanted to know is just how did they approach you for Halston?
Oh, for Halston. Okay, so
yeah.
So I was just finishing up The Plot Against America with David Simon. We were towards the end of that production, and I had gotten wind that this show had been coming to New York through a line producer that I had worked for before, for example, on a pilot that no one's ever heard of. And that pilot, which was a real doozy of a project, unfortunately never saw the light of day. It was for CBS, and it could have been great, but whatever. But anyway, that line producer that I worked with on that project is just so amazing and lovely, and we gelled really well. And she was going to be the line producer who was doing Halston. So that was my first, way to sniff it out that it was coming. And then after that, I said, there is no way that job is going to be shooting in New York, and I'm not going to be the designer of it.
Love it.
To me, it just felt like the perfect symmetry of all of the things that I love. And I desperately love fashion, to a fault. I desperately love period. I am a personal fan of Halston's work. And I really just admire, him as a designer and what he brought to the table to American fashion, changed American fashion. I mean, I feel like that appreciation of him was really born out of my experience at FIT. And, I just felt like it would be so great. And then I found out only after, actually, I think I had my first meeting for the project, that it was going to be Ewan. And then I just went, okay, well, now I have to get this job, because he's an incredible actor and somebody I've always wanted to work with. And really, when I was able to picture who Halston would be, through what vessel Halston would come back, I really felt like that much more compelled, because I just know he's such a brilliant actor. And I just felt like that it couldn't get any better at that point. And it was Dan Minahan, who, by the way, is, up there with Baz in my book, just absolutely brilliant. Such a clear creative voice and direction.
Absolutely.
Absolutely like a storyteller to the end, but also has such a personally chic eye that it's difficult to get by things that are just squeak this by, because he's got an eye. And I actually love that, because it's the best. It just makes you, sharpen your knife a little tighter.
it certainly helps you in your aesthetic vision. If somebody else is equally compelling in their aesthetic vision, I'm sure that there's a lot of harmony there. What was it actually like working with Ewan McGregor? I know that you got very extensively into the weeds about design and everything. So please tell us about Ewan.
So Ewan is truly, like I said, he's an amazing actor, and I really got to know that firsthand. And you always have to prepare for all cases when you're first working with an actor who's also the central person in an entire story. How much would he want to embody Halston, to a T, or where would we find those places where we could sort of shape it a little differently, texturally, or, for whatever reasons, also just to physically resemble a character, how can you create those, moments where you're really finding, kind of carving that shape out. So, Ewan was just lovely. And I mean, honestly, I could not have had a better Halston. I feel like the world couldn't have gotten a better Halston. He is so collaborative, so open. I mean, he walked into my office, and before he was even there, when I was in prep, I started to really feel this like strange sense. It's gonna sound so creepy, but I wanted to be surrounded by Halston, truly, because I was thinking about him. I was thinking about his voice so often at the early phase of that prep, when I'm just in research mode. And there's just such a huge archive of images that I had to dig out through Andy Warhol's personal snapshots, which are like unpublished, like literally looking through negatives of Andy Warhol's photos, looking through, Bill Cunningham photos, of him, or photos at Condé Nast or photos at Vogue, looking at old Women's Wear Daily images of him, anything that had been published, looking up even on eBay, if there was an article about him in Life magazine where there was a photo that had existed nowhere else. I found that Life magazine and ordered it. So I really had to gather everything. And then I had me and my team basically kind of went through everything and started to organize it, by year as best we could. Some things didn't really have a very firm date, but we sort of, by age, whatever, found a place. Created this crazy wall that became my like beautiful mind wall, everybody called it, which was surrounding my desk and my whole office. And it had every image of him from the earliest that existed to the end. And it helped me, I think, to visually be able to chart the journey for him stylistically, find where I could, because I'm a very visual person, I'm a very tactile person, find where I could sort of find a place to make a color story, yada, yada. Anyway, Halston, our Halston, Ewan walks into that, and just sort of like his jaw just dropped on the floor, and he was like, oh my gosh. He was like, we just kind of both had been so immersed in this person in a very different way. I think for me, I wanted to visually see him. I wanted to visually understand what his creative voice was from the designers that he had studied when he was growing up and admired when he was growing up. What books did he like? What music did he like? What art did he like? Just kind of absorb him artistically as much as possible. And then we just sort of gushed with each other, like, little, like two little chicks, like, and we just really started just vibing about who he was, some of our personal favorite images of him that we feel sort of embody what we think of Halston the most, and then start finding kind of that journey together. And yes, we worked far beyond, dressing him. It was how does he hold his hands? We were talking about that because I was, talking to him about how when you're working with a model, I don't like to look at a model or an actor so close up in a fitting, right? You always step back so you can absorb something as a whole, sort of see the visual effect of the costume or the balance of it or whatever. And so being able to work in a mirror is also very helpful in that, especially in small spaces or whatever. So I started talking about that, and he said, "Oh my God, that's so true. I saw this video of him looking at, working with a model and looking into a mirror." And we just sort of talked about those things. We talked about how to technically manipulate fabric and work scissors like you have your whole life, or pins. The pins thing was hilarious. I mean, I felt like I should have a stunt coordinator in the room, because it was like he was terrified every time he had to handle a pin. And so were, by the way, that gentleman on the screen, Oscar de la Renta. Every person who played a designer, I think, had a whole nother moment of understanding how there's like a whole nother level skill set, of designing. It's, there's a physical way that you have to relate to the things that you're touching and working with. If you're an artist, you know what paintbrush to choose and how to mix colors. So it's the same thing for a designer. And I think not everybody understands that. So
no, they don't. And you've given one of the best actors in the world a window into your craft, as you got to watch his craft, which is kind of a great back and forth gift.
Totally.
I knew that I could tell from the moment when I saw him rip from a bolt of fabric. I was like, oh, he's been trained. And also I'm standing right next to the camera.
Right.
I mean, it was just like, oh gosh, he really knows what he's doing here. And it just showed that you had guided him in all these, I mean, incredibly important details to get right.
Right.
If you're putting out a story about a fashion designer, what was it like to work with so much draping in this whole production? I mean, I just, of course, the 70s, so much bias, so much draping, so much fluidity. And it seems like almost in every aspect of the design that you had to touch, there was some element of draping. Was that something that was challenging for you, or fun, or how did you feel about that?
My happy place. It's my happy place. I literally went to FIT, so I'm very tactically connected to clothes. That's part of the education there. Right. And I think that also again comes from my grandmother. And I've been saying lately, I've been talking about her like too much. It's almost like I should start seeing a therapist.
Never enough.
But truly, I feel like she taught me to relate to clothes and to begin to imagine clothes through my hands and through creating them. So I'm very tactile in that way. And when it came to all these moments of invention on camera, where it was going to be a moment of, literally in the script, it just says, Halston finds a fabric, builds a dress, period. In the next scene. So there's a lot of, there was a lot of working with this story on a sort of a DNA level, which was so exciting for me, as not usually a part of the process as a costume designer. So to decide what would that visual moment be, what collection would he be building, what idea would he start with? I went to some of his principles in design. That's where I think where my studying him as a designer, really helped, because I really found myself clued into some of the sort of base principles and DNA in his design, like the bias, for example, and decide that we would do something even on the bias because it was important to his work and it reflected that 70s. And do the tie-dye initially, because the tie-dye is such a pivotal moment in his career and just feels so defining of that bridge between the 60s and 70s. And so this caftan, for example, on Rebecca was one of the first real moments of invention on camera. And I started with it by just I just grabbed a bunch of printer paper and I just said, I wanted to see fabric as a length and how I can start playing with it and coming to a silhouette that feels very early Halston, iconically Halston, the caftan, obviously. And then, what if I created a tie-dye shape for it that highlighted what the bias is, a literal visual education for everyone from Ewan McGregor to everyone on that set, actually, except for Rebecca, who knows fashion. I mean, truly. So it was kind of I just started drawing on paper what shapes make cool shapes when they turn, and that way. And that's how that was what birthed this caftan. It's a single seam caftan, which is a very iconic shape of his and pattern of his. And it had to be done free form through draping, which is not typically how this would even come together. I think the real like the deep cut fans will know that, but I wanted it to turn on her and to start forming that single seam, for it to happen organically, so I filmed it myself doing it. And then had, I even had my PA play the tailor, and you play like my assistant, you come play, the camera person. And we filmed it, and I sent it to Dan, and he was sort of like, love it, great. And then we started going through it. And then I ultimately started rehearsing it with Ewan himself. And that's kind of the birth of this moment, and that whole tie-dye collection.
Oh, they're so fabulous. And I have to ask, as a textile lover myself, did you have to recreate some of these tie-dyes yourself?
Yes.
So you got messy.
So we were able to get our hands on, ultimately, I think it was 3 caftans that were original Halston tie-dye caftans. And it was very difficult to do so because, as I've learned now, women had a lot of fun in their Halstons. So it was really hard to find collection worthy pieces that would look fresh and beautiful and new, like their first day out on the runway. This was, for example, a piece that we built, and he used a dyeing facility that was one of the very first, that really was doing tie-dye like on a whole new level. And so we worked with a wonderful New York dyer. His name is Jeff Fender. And I've been working with him for years, since Legally Blonde the musical, since you name it. And I sort of was like, I came to him with this big heavy heart, just like, there's literally no one else I trust to do this but you. He's such a brilliant dyer, and helped me pull off a lot of these. And they were a lot of, there is a lot of things about them that are authentically Halston, but there are some things about them that are not. And that's where the sort of curative process really was like key in deciding what would inhabit the spirit of Halston, but maybe not necessarily be all, carbon copy, because I didn't want it to ever look like a yard sale or like somebody's like collection of, I have these old Halston dresses. I wanted it to feel like the way a collection feels when it walks down a runway, which is like a runway show can be like a movie. It can be like, that's the intersection of fashion and costume. I think for me, that's a really happy place. When I watch a, Alexander McQueen fashion show, it feels like I am turning on a movie or a music video, and I think that's the part about it that I wanted to capture, of, that the colors all felt somewhat relative, and the spirit of the tie-dye all felt somewhat relative, and that it also all, popped against its environment. In that first fashion show, which you have, photos of some of those backgrounds, they are, that background, that drapery that surrounds that room is really wild. So I wanted the clothes to still be the star of the show. And so kind of just chose complementary, colors to that.
Absolutely. And I do believe I read that you were able to get some ultra suede material from the original maker, at least, so that you could, again, how important textiles are in his work, you were able to experience them. What was that like to work with that material?
So yeah, I was able to get the original ultra suede. The people who make it are like, they do tech fabric, that's their thing, and they primarily work with like Patagonia and REI, like all of these very camping gear. And they were like, no one's wanted ultra suede in a very long time. They were like, are you sure you want this? And their actual number one use of ultra suede now is the inside of iPhone covers. When you buy your iPhone covers, that's the ultra suede.
Well, I can't imagine that Halston would have seen that coming, but okay.
No, it's wild. And I think it was so exciting for them too, because of that. They put me in touch with one of the original engineers of the material from Japan who had worked with Halston. They gave me color cards of all of their original like archive color cards, and
Amazing.
we were able to find matches on the current ones. So it really was like, it was like geek out fantasy.
I love this attention to detail and this deep diving into history. And I want to segue into the Battle of Versailles, but before, and it's sort of part of the question, and you've touched on it a bit, is your love of research and sort of going as far back as you can to get as much information. What kinds of period sources did you turn to? Interviews with people that were associates of Halston's? Did you look at museum collections?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, Halston, it's not like doing Damnation where I couldn't talk to anybody that existed or was a part of that. I feel like doing Halston was a gift right now. And Dan had been trying to make this as a movie for 20 plus years. But doing it right now felt so important for many reasons, and I think I was so lucky that all of these people are still around. Actually quite a majority of them are not because of AIDS.
Yeah.
It's horrible, but a lot of people are, and including Chris Royer, who was a muse of his, was a Halstonette. Many of the Halstonettes are still around, and were very willing to talk about their experiences, about what he was like. There was Sassy Johnson, who is the head of Halston's Made to Order, who handled all of the couture clients. There was Gino Balsamo, who was a tailor in Halston's personal shop, and actually was the tailor who was personally tasked with making all of Halston's own clothes. So he was able to advise me on some of those little details. There was also research that was out there in the form of Women's Wear Daily Archive that, were just reviews of some of his earlier collections that there may be only one or two photographs from. But what I would actually read in the review of the collection, like Halston's showing cashmere mini dresses. He calls them the skimp. We'll see what the Upper East Side latest. It was like very cutely, written. And that, just taking in that, or just the way that fashion writing writes about colors and silhouettes, and I think that was also very inspiring for some of the earlier stuff.
I believe it. That's amazing. And were you able to see some collector's items or pieces in museums as well?
Yes, absolutely. Well, Chris Royer was extremely helpful, and I went to her home and went to her storage, where she has a insane collection of her own Halston that she loans out to museums, which is incredible. I mean, she had a few pieces, I believe, in the Studio 54 exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum that I was able to touch, before they were in the exhibit. So at that point, I was able to turn them inside out with her and study how they were constructed. So it really was like, that was the biggest blessing. And I told her that afterwards. I said, I think that was the key for me in really like just being able to inhabit a little better and understand the construction details and the nuances, the choices of buttons, the hems, the structure of everything, the fabrics, being able to touch those fabrics. There were other pieces as well. Lipscomb University has a small archive that was donated to them.
Oh, nice.
So I was able to look at those pieces, and they sent me tons of photographs of everything. So it was really helpful, I think, to touch and feel everything.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of resource we like to provide through our museum to designers as well, because there's so much you can learn by touching and turning inside out that you wouldn't necessarily learn from a photograph.
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think that's the most important thing, that experience of, just you could just get a better sense of everything too. It's like theater, it bring that existence,
Right.
being personally involved with something.
Hmm.
And I think it gives really translates to you, I think the tactile magic, and that's what brings me joy.
Fantastic. So I promised Battle of Versailles talk. So let's get to Battle of Versailles. What I particularly love about this as well is that you didn't just get to focus on Halston. You also got to sample a bunch of different American designers, the ones that participated in the show, like Stephen Burrows and Anne Klein and Bill Blass and Oscar. But you also had to replicate French couture, and the comparing and the contrast of that was really remarkable. So tell us about how you approach that.
Well, I definitely took a lot of license. I want to start with that. I knew when we were even doing Versailles, I was like, we won't do Versailles though, right? And they were like, no, we're doing Versailles. When we were first doing Versailles, we just sort of immediately had to get around the table of how we were going to do it, how we were going to condense and, make, because the actual Versailles, the production of it was just enormous. And, 90 models on stage at the same time, like, was very, huge. So to start condensing into what we were doing was like step one. But yes, speaking in all of those different languages, I think was just like a fun exercise. It was like to me, it felt like doing a little talent show. Like, here's going to be my Anne Klein, and I'm just going to do it with 3 looks and to sort of capture the spirit of that and capture what sort of thing she was doing at that time, kind of, again, just kind of filter down that. I often describe what I had to do on this show as turning, a novel, like turning War and Peace into a haiku, like just to take an entire body of somebody's work and condense it down to just a few images that would give you the impression and sort of somehow refract those memories, where it would feel like hat in the right kind of straw and the right kind, see somewhere in there some prints that felt relevant to that, and maybe some colors and textures and a silhouette that was just like the kind of thing that leaves such an impression on your brain. Yeah. So condensing that all to such a small amount of pieces ultimately, and not being able to do that with an entire stage full of
right. I didn't envy you that task, because I knew that you were going to have to just zip through it and really, like you said, get the sort of the colors, the silhouettes, the atmosphere, and just kind of distill it into something that you can, take a little bite out of and then move to the next part of the story.
Yeah. And what an exciting way also to really celebrate what made those voices so different. I think that's what I really was into, is like, let's show the Stephen Burrows, that's the silk jersey, lettuce edge Stephen Burrows, multicolor rainbow Stephen Burrows. Let's show the Anne Klein that was full on just tribal Africana, like just her fully doing this Donna Karan before Donna Karan story.
Right.
And, Donna Karan, by the way, was her assistant.
Right.
And was there also at Versailles. So, I mean, there was kind of just finding those little notes to hit that made everything kind of sing in a different way and give some spirit to embody everything. And then for the European collection, I really took a lot of license. I mean, our show is not straying that far from the truth, because it really was, very sort of Baroque.
Right.
And the dresses were much more formal. So I just kind of took that and ran with it and kind of tried to echo a little of what Givenchy was doing, or Dior, but legitimately was just trying to give it that sort of romantic French, Cinderella story.
Yeah, well, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. So, brava. And then, of course, you had Liza to add her special touch to the event. And I am dying to know how was it to interpret these larger than life muses for Halston. And I'm thinking mostly of Liza Minnelli and Elsa Peretti, but also Martha Graham, because I feel like, you know, these are three very different, strong, forceful women. And I loved at the end that Martha sort of brought the creativity back for him, but, you know, they were all inspirational to him. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think I just wanted to reflect a little bit of why those three women, and there are more, you know, but why in particular our show and with those three women, really what their common thread was between them and what brought them together, whether it was a love of dance, a love of, you know, schmaltz, if you will, you know, or theatrical dancing versus ballet versus modern versus just a beautiful French woman that just kind of, you know, blows everyone away, or Elsa. I mean, all these people, they all have something very special. And, you know, Elsa has she truly deserves her own show. I mean, this is all I've been hearing since the show has come out, is because it's true. And she is such a legend in her own right. She is so immensely, just powerfully, you know, creative and contributed quite a bit to bringing Halston the aesthetic. You know, pairing it with those equestrian belts was the key to making those cashmere maxi dresses fabulous. And, you know, pairing it with a bone cuff, it was the perfect note to hit together. And that's why they worked so well together. And, you know, so I really wanted to just embody her spirit, and Rebecca literally can wear anything. And so that was just like absolute joy. You know, and it was hard to not put her exclusively in black, I will say, because she wore so much black in her real life. And I always wanted her to contrast with Halston. But Martha's just, you know, was very simple. All of these people, what's so beautiful about all of them is that they take a very complex thing and a very dynamic, different piece of artistry, and they have a very sort of Noguchi sensibility where they just boil all these complex ideas down to something that is very ultimately simple. And that is such a beautiful thing. And I think he thought and worked in the same way. And that's why they all sort of gelled. And when I was doing all these different women, I was just celebrating, you know, who they were and how that kind of married into that same idea.
Gosh, well, what an incredible job you did with everything, every aspect of the production. I as a fashion historian and somebody who loves textiles, that was the biggest treat of my year so far, and I can't imagine it being surpassed. I could also talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but I'm going to open it up to the Q&A portion of the evening because we have to let our audience get some questions in too. So let me see, what do we have here? Okay, we have a question about your Latin American roots, and do they inform your work, and if so, how?
100%. How could it not? You can't erase who you are. It's who you are. No, 100%. I think how it influences my work is it taught me to never take anything for granted, to appreciate every moment. I know where I came from. I know my parents worked really, really hard to give me the opportunities that I had to get an education and go to school. And so I don't want any of that to go to waste. And, you know, even when I'm just sort of like, you know, F it, I don't want to get out of bed, I don't want to work so hard anymore, I'm just like, no, I have to do it for them. I have to do it for them. And so legit, I think it's a big piece of who I am. It also influences my work, I think, artistically, because my family has always seen things very vibrantly. I grew up in a very vibrant household with music playing and watching movies and watching old movies. I mean, I grew up on old musicals. My parents had like Bette Midler spinning, you know, that was like the tracks at the house most of the time. So I just like grew up in this world where that's just kind of, we celebrated dance, we celebrated music and art, and took me to museums. So it just was like a big piece of who I am.
That's wonderful. Thank you for answering that question. A question about the Martha Graham costumes. Somebody says, the costumes for the dance company near the end were breathtaking. Were those exact copies of Halston's work, or did you take any creative freedoms with the dance costumes presented in the story?
So it's a combination. There are these red spandex, essentially squares. Well, for the first iteration is the bandage version, right? Which
right,
written that way, and I was just sort of like, okay, and just to sort of invent it. I just started inventing. We did sort of filter down that we did want to do these what we called flying squirrel costumes, which were they're very sort of geometric shapes. They're just big squares, sort of like you take the Vitruvian Man and you draw a square around him, and that becomes the costume. And and so that's where that started. And then I just sort of worked backwards from what are all the different ways your brain can go on your way to making that square. If you were starting with bandages, and then here are 6 ideas for that. And then B, what's kind of living around that. So I did borrow some of his designs, because obviously the whole time, this whole show, I wanted to reflect his work. So, so I took that square, straight from something that he had done. And there were unitards, and these gold unitards that are part of the earlier piece, part of the piece that we were calling Spring. That whole ballet, start to finish, though after editing, you see a good portion of it was truly, I think, feel like 10-15 minutes long, and so there were several parts of it. And there was a beginning Spring, which were these unitards I borrowed that he made directly for Acts of Light, and I did them in the original sort of gold yellow color that he had done them. And then all of the other women, there's sort of a central figure, and Persephone, and her mother, and Demeter, and all of these people that surrounded that central part of this story, of this little 15-minute ballet that I was able to sort of design as a ballet. I did invent those, actually, because I wanted them to sort of inhabit, again, in the voice of Halston, but I wanted them to move in the way that they wanted to move. I wanted them to tell the story of Persephone, to feel like a rebirth, and I think be white, just so they felt, all the more ghostly, and so that was a place where I got to sort of find my happy little design voice in there.
That's wonderful. This was something I didn't actually get to, but I'm glad somebody's asked about it. The scenes where Halston starts to change his look, i.e. slicked back hair and self-tanner, etc., is one of my favorites from the series. What were some of the things you wanted for those scenes to truly convey he was defining what would become his look? So that also touches on the evolution of his look.
Right, yeah. I mean, the scene is that turtleneck going over his head. So here's the first one. Have 16 turtlenecks hanging ready, because each time it's going to be stretched out and not work as well as the last.
Multiples.
Multiples. No, it's really, the evolution factor was just about just kind of pulling out that contrast as much as possible. So really, he did wear some turtlenecks prior in his life. I didn't want to show them, obviously. So we just really stuck to button downs and, simpler shapes that were not going to mirror that at all. So it really felt like a full butterfly moment. But the evolution in Halston's personal style, I think, really was this moving from boy to man. I mean, that's kind of what I felt when I was, charting out his visual course. But yeah, that moment, I've loved that moment too. I think it's one of the moments, I think, where we really see him just so intimately with himself. You see that invention moment of,
Mm-hmm.
when it was first just written on the page and we were all sitting around in a round table discussion about it, I just sort of went, you guys, this is his Batman moment. This is when he's becoming Batman, because it really is that moment. It's sort of like it feels like the birth of the mythology.
Yeah.
And so we also played with, even what towels were there were my choices, and what robe would be hanging in the background. And then after that, just about how I was going to take that same image and also manipulate it as the journey went on, so that it wasn't exclusively just a black turtleneck and pants, because that'd get very boring to look at. And you also just want to know his life a little bit more dynamically.
Right. Well, it's a wonderful transformation. Another question. I love learning about your research process. How much time did you have to prepare before filming started?
So I think it was about a month.
Oh my goodness.
No, I'm sorry. Of like my prep process before I really had a chance to like be in my studio and like get hands on clothes. But that was, I think it wasn't much more. I think it was like 2 months, something like that. Wow. So 2 months from when sort of I first got wind of the job to when we started shooting, I think it was something like that, 2.5 months. And as soon as I got the project, I started immediately on learning everything I possibly could about him, about his clothes, and just refamiliarizing myself on some level, but really just like learning it all on a new level. Also, I think people don't really understand that it wasn't just about Halston, although yes, obviously this is like the it will now say designed Halston on my gravestone, because this show has meant that much to me. But genuinely, it's about celebrating fashion, through these periods of history, and how his clothes lived in the fashion landscape. So truly making his clothes feel like they even belonged in 1968 was quite difficult, because they are so modern and relevant.
So true.
And so that was kind of a huge challenge. What else are we going to fill this canvas with so that we genuinely know it's 1968? And who other designers can we celebrate, and let's bring in Bonnie Cashin, who is an incredible influence in fashion. Nobody ever talks about, and yet those early Coach, what we think of now as Coach silhouettes, are so, to me, as that was like my geek out moment. I had lots of them in this show, but doing a girl in this little leather, Bonnie Cashin outfit was like such a joy. Or doing a girl who, was completely covered in like a brocade boots with a matching brocade jacket, and, a little like flourish of a, vampire, like ruffled little thing with a brooch.
Right.
Inspiration, that whole Dark Knight inspiration. Like I just wanted to just highlight the contrast between the world that was genuinely happening at the same time, as these very, slick, beautiful, simple, minimalist clothes.
Right. Or the Upper East Side lady in her suit with a leopard collar.
Oh,
you needed to have
Mark.
all the range of contrast to see just how special and different Halston's aesthetic was as it was emerging. And now it's his fingerprints are on everything now. I mean, it's really hard to get away from, like you said, the look of modern.
Right.
Is Halston. I have a fun question. Hi, Jeriana. Do you have any funny anecdotes from set? What was a particularly challenging moment that stands out during this experience?
The whole thing was challenging. I mean, the whole thing's challenging. But what's something funny? Gosh, I mean, everything was funny. I keep it light. I mean, it has to be light. It has to be funny. It has to be hopeful and joyous and all of those things. To me, that's a place where creativity thrives and flourishes. So, so we had fun all the time, and we had fun with Ewan when he was, you know, in the shop and just kind of like pumping good music and practicing, you know, how to turn fabric on the bias or show, you know, all of those little moments. We had funny moments where you know, with Liza too, because we had to create the red dress on Liza, the gotcha dress, doing her Versailles performance number outfit. I mean, we had so many, I have so much fun designing dance costume or costumes that celebrate movement and dance. And that was just like, it was just like a riot doing those fittings where, you know, we're rehearsing the choreography and I'm like, move that rack out of the way. She needs more dance floor to practice this. But no, we have great fun every day. I believe in keeping a positive work environment. I want everyone on my team to be having a great time. And because the work is going to be tough, like here's the real talk. It will never be easy. It's always going to be hard. And if it's not hard, then you're doing something wrong, because you should always be challenging yourself to do better. And at least that's how I feel about me. That's me talking to myself. But definitely, I think it's always going to be tough. So let's just have a great time doing it.
I think that's amazing advice to end on. I want to give you a huge thanks for being with us this evening, for sharing so many fascinating insights about your work on Halston, and for being such an inspiration to the next generation of costume designers. And we hope to welcome you soon, hopefully in person with your costumes, to the FIDM Museum very soon. Very, very soon, hope. We're so eager to get back to me. We're so eager to get back to having our exhibitions, and we can't wait to feature you again.
I can't wait to be back there in person again. I just being at those exhibitions and your yearly display, Emmy's display, always just makes me so happy. And
thank you. And we hope we'll be a resource for you for your next period research project.
100.
Come on over. We're here for you. So thank you so much, Jeriana. I really appreciate it. And our audience thanks you so much.
Bye.
Good night. And next month, from June 23rd to the 25th, FIDM is hosting an exciting 3 days of fashion virtual event. And if you're interested, the RSVP link is being placed in the chat. And we invite you to follow us on Instagram at Jeriana at FIDM Museum. And I want to thank you all for joining us so much. Good night.